how strange this war is. The amount of old, out-of-date weapons I've seen held. I've seen World War II era guns being fired by people on the front. Most of the tanks getting destroyed are getting destroyed by like artillery bombardments, rocket strikes. These aren't the type of vehicles that are going to engage in many tank battles. They're really just moving artillery cannons with armor to help you push troops forward. Sending 50s and 60s era Chinese tanks from Albania to Ukraine to fight we're like one step from being the Taliban with tankettes at this point. What do you think the future prospects for aid to Ukraine, Western aid to Ukraine, is? Do you think it's going to continue through the winter and into the new year, like steady flows of aid, or do you see any signs it's going to peter out as this counteroffensive re-encourage the West to double or redouble their efforts in support of Ukraine?
I think that unfortunately there has been some petering out of heavy weapons support with instead focus on more accurate systems and perhaps the HARMs and the and certain artillery systems and more ammunition. But I think that there's a lot of things that that could be done. That the West can still send. The two main problems really is that Western countries need to send heavy equipment, meaning IFVs, tanks, and artillery, stuff like that, because the success in Kharkiv was achieved by mechanized and tank units, and in order to have um, a war of maneuver, you need those units. So it will be the problem is that the quality and quantity of former Soviet tanks available to Western countries is questionable. And then there's also the issue that 155 millimeter ammunition, while it's being produced in large quantities in the West, those quantities aren't large enough to sustain anywhere near the volume that the Russians are expending in 152 millimeter ammunition. Because if America was firing artillery rounds at the volume that the Russians have been, they would have been out of 155 millimeter ammunition by now. Because from what estimates I see in the last 30 years, American procurement of 155 millimeter ammunition has been close to 5 million shells. And that's less than has been spent in Ukraine in the past 6 months by the Russians. So it's not an easy thing. I mean, the reason for that is that America relies much more on its air force rather than its artillery arm. It's not because of a lack of capability or foresight on the side of the Americans. It's just that that right now it's not an air force fight in Ukraine.
This is not how America would fight the war in Ukraine.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
This is differently but Ukraine just doesn't have the same capabilities as the United States has.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's not like the United States can just send its jets in and start bombing stuff.
Exactly, and of course, America has its own strategic worries. They can't just send all of their artillery ammunition. So artillery ammunition will be one problem, and tanks will be another problem. I actually decided to go over and compile what former Soviet tanks are still in stock with NATO countries. And I decided to also give them a rating. Apparently, I found out that Albania has Chinese Type 59 tanks, but I don't think that's verifiable, really. I don't know. I don't know about that. But Romania has a lot of equipment, but it's an awful quality and just terrible overall. Those TR-580s and T-55s, woof! Come on, Romania, get up to NATO standard. Bulgaria has quite a few of T-72s that they could still give. And Slovenia, Croatia, and Slovakia have some more modern T-72 variants that they could send, and quite a few of them. It's just that a lot of these countries are unwilling to send that equipment unless they get replacements from the Germans. So like Leopard 2s or M1A1s, M1A2s, and whatever, like tanks from the Americans. So I think that, so here I've tallied them, and there's around 434 tanks in reserve, 130 of which are Hungarian. So I think we should count them out because the Hungarians are not going to send aid. I mean, look at them.
Yeah,
They're in
no.
a sorry state. Yeah, so there's probably around 300 tanks that are in reserve of T series. Some of and there's another 500 or so that are in active service. The ones in active service are less likely to be sent because not everybody is as zealous as Poland in sending aid. The Poles have sent around 400 T-72 variant tanks, but the problem is the Poles only have around 70 left. They might send all of them, but yeah, the Poles are out. So there'll need to be other countries, and I think especially we should be looking at Bulgaria because they have around 250 T-72s in storage. And then, I mean, there's those 500 that are, of questionable availability because they're in active service, and those countries want to maintain their capability in the long term. And then there's around 300 more T-series tanks, which are the TR-580, TR-85, and T-55s. Basically, all of these are either modernizations of the T-55 from the 50s or variants. I mean, these tanks are all Romanian, and they're all just god awful. And I don't
They're
think we
iron
should be sending them.
coffins.
Yeah, they're iron coffins. I mean, already it seems that Slovenia will be sending 20 some of its T-55, the M55S, which is another modernized T-55 tank, to Ukraine. So I think that's, a pitiful display, and I think that Western countries should, those countries which are safe, like Croatia isn't getting invaded anytime soon, or Slovenia, they're going to have to be given, training with modern NATO tanks, and have these tanks freed up to be sent to Ukraine. I think that's what the Western countries should be focusing on, and especially America.
Albania has those Chinese tanks that somebody's bringing up in chat right now, most likely because of how quickly they sided with China after the Sino-Soviet split, correct?
Yeah, but it's just the numbers that I question. I mean, the source on Wikipedia basically said that they couldn't verify it, and that apparently they have 40 operational out of 721 Type 59s in storage.
That'd be crazy. Could you imagine 700, like out of nowhere, you just hear fucking like the Red Army created new, like blaring in the background, and like this Chinese tanks charging over the hill with Ukrainian flags on the top as they on Kherson. Like, could you imagine? They basically just strap TNT to the like front of it, just send it towards Russian lines.
Crazy. Yeah, I mean those the Albanians had gone pretty, like, under Enver Hoxha. They were pretty nuts about a potential NATO invasion. They built innumerable bunkers all across Albania and heavily militarized the country. So it's not inconceivable. It's just a problem that, the Type 59 is basically a T-55 copy. I'm pretty sure.
This is stuff that basically was being used in the 60s, right?
Yeah, it's awful. Like, we shouldn't be sending Type 59s to Ukraine. Like, seriously. T-72s, I think, are a minimum. Yeah.
What would you say to the philosophy? Because I've seen some people just say that, look, okay, I understand that a lot of these things are garbage, okay? But at the end of the day, like, these tanks are not really engaging in like tank battles. That's not really happening here. Right? Most of the tanks getting destroyed are getting destroyed by like artillery bombardments, rocket strikes, and these like arm shouldered like type weapons. We're talking about javelins, not HIMARS, but like javelins, Panzerfaust, stuff like that. And so therefore these really are kind of like a means to an end of just like an armored line to push forward. These aren't the type of vehicles that are going to engage in many tank battles. They're really just moving artillery cannons with armor to help you push like troops forward. So therefore, just give them whatever moves and is made of some steel and made of some iron. What would you say to something like that?
Yeah, so to something like that, it's the same thing that I said when we spoke last time, which is really that whatever it is that is being sent to Ukraine, the main consideration when it comes to the tanks is the ability for Ukraine to train crews for them and the ability to logistically sustain them. That's why it makes more sense to send all T-72s rather than sending Leopard 2 tanks. Because from what I understand, Leopard 2 crewmen say that it will take, 2 or 3 years to get a capable crew to field a Leopard 2 tank. And of course, the logistical difficulties. There are tanks that the systems that the Ukrainians are unfamiliar with, and they're not as easy as, for example, artillery systems. So the priority number 1, 2, and 3 should be the logistics of fielding those tanks. So yeah, if somehow the Ukrainians are able to, find the ammunition and the crews to field T-55s, I mean, by all means, maybe in some quiet sectors of the front they should, but I mean, if it's more, the Ukrainians might decide that it's more trouble than it's worth, to find the ammunition and logistical support for a T-55, go through all that effort just to have a tank that is insanely subpar, that is just basically completely outdated. Because another thing we need to consider is that while they don't go on tank combat, they will definitely face ATGMs, right? So ATGMs and RPGs. A T-55 is basically worthless against an RPG-7, let alone cornets or more modern.
Just put a cope cage on it. It'll be fine.
Yes, put the chicken wiring in front just to slow down.
Just like take one of those cat toys, just tape it to the side, and it'll distract it.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So basically, I think it's up to the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians are stressing, give us T-72s, give us T-72s. That's the main thing they're talking about.
My question to you is, eventually, this is crazy, but like I never thought any of these tanks would ever be used in a modern war again, if I'm being completely frank. And the fact that we're in this situation just shows how strange this war is. The amount of old, out-of-date weapons I've seen held. I've seen World War II era guns being fired by people on the front, right? And I've seen it on film, and I've seen it in person, right? So it's wild when you see it's wild to see one person holding a javelin next to somebody holding a World War II era machine gun. It is the strangest war. And so eventually, though, the West just doesn't have the world's largest storage of T-72s. And Ukraine can't just get by if this war goes on and on forever on just scraping by on Western storages and capturing whatever the Russians abandon. What can the West do to supplement Ukraine sustainably? Is there any way for them to open production lines on T-72s if they have any in some of the post-Soviet states, or kind of try to change some auto lines to do that? Is there is there going to be a point where we're just going to have to say, I guess we're going to have to start at some point training them on Western tanks at some point?
Yeah, I think that while it's a hard decision to make, Western countries should understand that the stockpiles of T-72s, if this war really drags on, are finite, and the Russians have way more of them, and they can afford to waste way more of them than Ukraine can. And the more hodgepodge, the more different variants of T-72s and older T-series tanks that the West has to send, the more spare parts, the more different standards, the more. So
I mean, if we're talking about sending 50s and 60s era Chinese tanks from Albania to Ukraine to fight we're one step from being the Taliban with tankettes at this point, sending them tankettes. Exactly. There's a problem here that needs to be addressed.
We might as well bust down the museums and start pulling out T-34s to send. So that's not the best. I mean, to be fair though, there's some museums in the UK that have T-64s and T-72s, and who could get them out of there and sent to Ukraine, back in working order. But no, I think that the main thing that the West should be focusing on is creating the logistical network to eventually support a type of Western tank. Now, whether that will be the Leopard 1, Leopard 2, or M1A1, each one has its problems. The Leopard 1 is pretty old, but they're available in large numbers. Their ammunition is available in large numbers. There's countries like Greece and Turkey which have more than 500 of these just laying around each. So there are a lot of tanks there that can be sent, and they're probably the easiest to learn out of the bunch. But
Hmm.
they're the least protected. Um,
The Leopard
and
2, though, is we're talking about something that would take years to try
yeah,
to really transition over, and it would be a lot more complicated to train the crews on.
yes. So the Leopard 2 has the problem that it's logistically more difficult to support it. It will be a far more different platform, because it's just it's not an easy, not an easy thing to learn. And that's what Leopard crewmen are saying. That's what the Ukrainians are saying. Basically saying that, sending us too few tanks will do more harm than good. Just, we will either need the network or to support them, or just don't send them at all. Don't send like Leopard 2s just like that. They won't do any good, and you'll see them destroyed for no reason. So that's the problem with Leopard 2s is their weight, their complexity, and the fact that they're just hard to manufacture, hard to train crews on. And then I think that those problems are times two'd when
So
it comes to the Abrams tanks.
we do have a quote from an insider, from a U.S. defense official. This is actually from very recently. This actually came from just a few hours ago. U.S. defense official said tanks are on the table for Ukrainian forces, but Ukrainian forces will have to show that they will be able to maintain more modern variants in order to receive said modern variants. And so this is talking about the very issue we're talking about right now. They need to be able to show that they can, work with these tanks, that they can maintain these tanks, and they can use these tanks and transition off of a T-72.
I imagine I mean, with the training programs going on and the fact that, Ukrainian servicemen have found themselves in NATO countries receiving training, they will probably have considered the use of more modern NATO tanks. So yeah, of course, this is a rumor. We can't know for sure just yet, but obviously, like the road is one of transition away from Soviet systems and towards Western ones for Ukraine. Because let's be real, like their ability to manufacture ammunition and parts is just way diminished. The Russian strikes on repair facilities and factories have been pretty devastating. So Ukraine just cannot rely on its own industry at the moment to produce Soviet era equipment. They need to start transitioning to a Western military standard. So that goes for tanks too. But for now, we need to be considering that the stopgap that is available, the fact that there's around almost 1,000 seemingly tanks of the T series just milling around in NATO militaries, and that those tanks should be replaced by hopefully Abrams tanks or Leopards if those Western militaries are ready to receive them.
We're also not
Because in
talking about
terms,
the logistical issues that even come with these tanks. So people bringing this up
yeah,
in chat that like these tanks are going to be much harder to support. Like an Abrams is a lot harder to support than the
yeah,
T-72.
and Abrams you don't send to Ukraine. I don't think it's realistic to send Abrams to Ukraine. I can see the Leopard 2. It's not going to be easy,
Yeah, but wouldn't it be
but
cool?
Abrams, oof. It would be really cool. Don't get me wrong, but it's just that yeah, the Americans have an insane tooth to tail ratio. They have an insane support network for their machines. that the
The
Ukrainians
thing
don't.
is, every army on the planet like will brag about their soldiers being tough, or like they can do like 2 backflips, or like they can like they got good aim, or they make things go kaboom. And Russia and China and North Korea and Bashar al-Assad, like all these countries will do that, especially, and you'll see a lot of military parades like that. The thing is, America doesn't do that as much. Like they'll have like somewhat patriotic commercial stuff, but because it's like One of the best things America is good at is just logistical end of it, but there's no like way to make like a cool song about logistics, you know?